Ever wonder what makes really creative people tick? Where do their ideas come from? What keeps them energized? What kinds of things get in their way? Is their life really as much fun as it looks from the outside? Hello, I'm your host, Lily Pierpont, and this is ArtStorming, a podcast about how new ideas come to life and become paintings, sculptures, plays, or poems, performances, or collections. Each episode, I'll chat with a guest from the arts community and explore how the most creative among us stare down a blank canvas or reach into the void and create something new. It's hard to know where to begin with an introduction to my next guest, in part because he has two distinct identities. As an artist-photographer, he is Tommy Bruce. As the artist subject of his photography, he is Atmos. So I guess you'd say that his work is a collaboration between Tommy and Atmos. And when I say he, which when I had the wherewithal to ask about pronouns, he said was fine with him, because non-binary pronouns also don't exactly cover the interspecies universe of Tommy and Atmos. But here are a couple of descriptors that do. Furry, yes, I said furry, and delightful. Listen, and I think you'll agree.
All right.
Excellent. Well, Tommy, thank you so much for helping me get this set up. This is going to be the first one that I've done remotely. Everything else we've done, I've been in studio with my guest. But I'm really excited to try this because it's going to expand my horizons in general. So thanks for getting this started.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So for a little background, we met at Ellsworth Gallery a while back, and I had the great privilege of seeing not one but two of your shows, and you also participated in Strange Bedfellows, which was that sort of crazy installation piece that we did. And I got to know a little bit about your work through that. But what I'm starting with other guests is to say a little bit that we wouldn't know about you from looking at your website. Like, what's just something that you could share?
Sure. Boy, something about me. I consider myself to be from the suburbs. And I think that's really important to where my perspective as an artist is growing up in suburban green grass lawn, Pennsylvania. And I'm a big cook. That's not going to be on my artist website, but that's probably what I spend most of my time doing outside of art and work.
Well, no, that's perfect. That's a great lead in because, part of what I'm exploring in this podcast series is what creatives do to kind of access the creative field. And so something that you do that's outside of the direct realm of photography or your artwork, something like cooking is a perfect access point, an entry point. Because I think a lot of people think creatives have to be, so disciplined that they're only in their one niche. But, typically there's this whole universe that we can draw from.
Oh, yeah. No, I think of cooking as being, very much like the artistic process, that it's like learning about materials and, techniques and concepts and kind of, different regions are, have all these histories. And then the process of, making a recipe is the planning and then execution and then, critique while I'm eating it. And then the nice thing is that it's just gone afterwards too.
No evidence. Yeah. Well, so just to tie that into your original comment, what kind of foods do you cook? Are they based on Pennsylvania, cooking? Is it home style cooking? What do you like to do?
I'm kind of, I've never, I don't get to travel out. Well, yeah, I don't travel outside the country very much, not for any, good reason other than financially. But and I'm not much of a polyglot. Like I'm not very good at other languages. So, but I do think of food as being a way that I enjoy accessing and learning about other cultures. So I've been on a kind of a Chinese kick for the last few years, learning how to cook with a wok, and just learning about the different kind of ingredients and philosophies behind recipes in like Szechuan kind of cuisine. A lot of that. I did work in a bakery for a while, and I learned a lot about like laminated pastry dough. So croissants and pies and things like that are also kind of like I think they're very intimidating because, the recipe is simple. It's, water and flour and butter, but there's a lot to learn in the technique, and then you have to move fast. So you have to kind of like, you learn a lot just by doing it and feeling the material, and kind of listening to it. So I've enjoyed that.
How does that segue into your photography? I mean, you're contemporary enough in your photography that you've probably done digital most of your life, but does that have any correlation to working in the darkroom? Have you ever worked in the darkroom with your work?
Yeah, I mean, the darkroom is interesting. Where to start? Photography is the first thing that I really was drawn to as an artist. I didn't think of myself as an artist. As a kid, I didn't think of myself as anything. I just was a kid who liked to play video games and spent a lot of time outside of my body because of that, And I couldn't really draw, or I wasn't inclined to. I think drawing took a kind of discipline and like focus that I never really had. And when I got into high school, and a friend basically gave me a camera, and digital photography was so appealing because it was so instantaneous. I mean, photography is already instantaneous, but digital is even faster because it's right there. It takes a second to think about it, less than a second to take it, and it's immediately available for review. And so there's something about the immediacy of that process that initially I think was very exciting to me, and continues to be exciting because my ideas come faster than my attention span. I've kind of always got like 20 projects going. But I did enjoy particularly in undergrad, where I had a lot of access to a lot of equipment. I went to the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, and they had excellent darkrooms, an excellent studio, lighting studio. We even had a color print processor and color darkrooms, which they broke that down the year after I left in 2014. So I feel very lucky that I was able to use that at all. But I enjoyed kind of coming to film after getting my sea legs in digital because it made me slow down. Large format photography was really important to me, learning how to use like a camera, with the big, like the bellows, and, having to put a sheet over my head and look at the image inverted on this plane of glass, and making these kind of super subtle adjustments to the frame really taught me to pay attention to kind of like the corners, the edges of the frame, and slowed down my process for capture. And then that ultimately came back to digital. I think a reason though that I haven't stuck with the darkroom is that I think that the material that you're using to make the work is, important in conceptually to the work. So most of my work it's self-portraiture, and it's also this kind of like community reflection. And, most of who I am and most of this community that I engage with has been a kind of very contemporary internet and mediated world. And so digital photography always seemed just like the right kind of material for the kind of images I was making. So that's why I've kind of come back to it. And yeah.
That's all the more reason then that I can see why you would like cooking, which is a much more hands-on material-based thing, as a kind of foil to the digital, very quick, impressionistic thing that you do with your photography.
Absolutely.
So that's a kind of balance that I see you're striking there.
Yeah.
So you danced around the edges of community and self-portrait. Since we are doing this on the podcast medium, which is obviously audio, and we don't have the visuals, can you say a little bit more about your self-portraiture, what that depicts, and that community that you just referred to?
Sure, yeah. So my work primarily is a reflection on the furry community. So some people know about furries, some people don't. The elevator pitch is that it's a fan culture wherein people create anthropomorphic, human-like animal personas, and they embody them through costuming, through illustration. There's a lot of online kind of like fandom around media that has animal characters in it, like Zootopia or Redwall, or what's kind of an older, I don't know, people love Bluey right now. The show with the dogs, for the little kids show from Australia. But that is kind of like the on paper what this community is about. But in reality, it's, I think, a really complex social phenomenon that is tied to a lot of different things. I place Furry as the kind of center of a Venn diagram between like cosplay and a kind of like a drag persona, and then a fetish or kink community, and then also just kind of a queer identity like transness or, anything within the LGBTQ purview. Because I think of it as like a lens that you look at the world through, a kind of a desiring lens.
All the language that you just used is super available to a lot of our listeners, but for some of our listeners who are, maybe your parents or even grandparents' age, sure. Say it even more simplistically, or not simplistically, but just give us, without some of the jargon that we know, like a little bit more immediate about what furry culture is, because I had not been introduced to it. And I'm now so fascinated by it. And actually, because you were the ambassador for me to understand it,
sure.
You're the perfect person, I think, to explain not just how it appears on the outside, but what it's like on the inside for you as a member of the furry community.
Yeah, so like very literally what it's like is it's people who create an alternate persona that is like, for me, there's a lot of community terminology, which I'll define as we go. Fursona is the name for your alternate self. So my fursona is a white-tailed deer. His name is Atmos. So I have a costume that looks much like a kind of on first glance, it looks like a mascot costume. They're a lot more detailed and kind of bespoke, and I don't know, just kind of more tightly detailed compared to like a sports mascot, I would say. But that's the closest referent for most people. And so I wear this costume at conventions is primarily where furries gather. So like a large convention in Chicago that just happened in December, Midwest Fur Fest, had, I think, around 17 or 18,000 people attending. That's the largest convention in the world. Probably higher than that with people who didn't register. But yeah, that's one of the biggest ones. I was at one in California about a month ago that had probably 5,000 people at it.
Just to be clear, so these are people that all have a persona like Atmos, and they come to the convention as that persona, and then they engage with people as other people who are also engaging as personas. So it's sort of like a huge convention of an alternate reality in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so one, we're not all in costume all the time. The costumes are hot and laborious to wear. That's why I relate it to something like drag, where it's like it's something you put on, and when you're wearing it, it's kind of like a special, time. You are kind of performing, you're on. When you're not in costume at a convention, you're identifying each other usually by like a badge that you're wearing that is like an illustration of your character. So you see, your friend at the convention who maybe you've met online, and you look at their face, and then you look down and you see like, oh, I recognize that icon from, Twitter or something like that. And then that kind of helps you connect with this person who you've met online and all their kind of persona there.
This is so exciting. What's so interesting to me about that is that you can have encountered another persona in costume. So in that place, and you meet them at this convention and you see the person that's behind that persona. How often is that a total surprise or a shock, or how often are the people like their avatars?
Yeah, I mean, it's always an interesting relationship to see the fursona and the person behind it, because for some people it's totally clockable, as they say. You can totally say like, oh yeah, I see how you got there. And sometimes it's a total inverse. You have someone who is very kind of unassuming looking. You know, you see a lot of like, you know, guys with glasses and shaved head, and they don't necessarily project a lot in their clothes they wear. And then their persona is, you know, this like pink sparkle dog, you know, that is very
Right.
kind of like bombastic. And you can see how like, oh, for this person, you know, that is kind of like an outlet for them in a way that, you know, maybe this body doesn't feel, you know, like it can relate to that. But this other body of mine lets me access that part that, you know, that is a part of myself.
So what's interesting parallel here is that it's not unlike you're just creating a three-dimensional painting that interacts in its universe that you can perform on in lots of different venues. So unlike, you know, a painter might have a way of expressing themselves on a tableau that has a different or alternate reality to, they might be very unassuming and they present as a sparkle dog on canvas, but this is sort of a more the live version of something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, it is like this culture is so wrapped up in the way that the internet has changed how we see ourselves and how we interact in the world. And so I think even 10 or 15 years ago, it was a little harder to understand for people. But nowadays, I think we understand like people have personas online. You know, they have a kind of like curated projection that they put out of themselves. And, you know, this persona, being a furry, is kind of about like recognizing the potential of that, you know, that like, okay, when I'm online, I could really be anything, you know, like, because we're not working in physical space. So you know, Furry is saying like, okay, so what if I was something that's impossible for my real self, for my other self? And then, you know, what's fascinating about it is that these conventions and through these costumes, it's taking this, you know, fantastical version of yourself that you've created, and it's turning it back into something that's real through costuming and through role play. And costuming is, I think it's one of the most fascinating parts of the furry community, but, you know, we also do this through illustration and through writing and through fashion and all these other things. There's a whole subset of furries who are really interested in like pool toys sculptures, like these inflatable sculptures as this like 3D cartoon. And there's like a whole little market of people who make these custom inflatable sculptures for fun. And they're like the coolest things I've ever seen. Like my partner, who is also a furry and also a kind of like art school artist, is working on making these inflatable sculptures that, you know, are meant for the gallery. So there's so much potential for, I think, furry to be looked at as a kind of like avenue for fine art, but it is primarily what's awesome about it is that it's mostly people making art for self-fulfillment and for community engagement. So there's something really kind of like I don't know, wholesome and pure about that it's
Yeah.
not for anything other than for people's fulfillment. And it's also, I think, kind of like lost in a lot of normative culture, this idea that like I might just get art of myself to help me see and be myself.
That's such an important distinction because if you think about it, I mean, so many, especially the art culture that the more traditional, where an artist makes a piece, they put it in a gallery, it sells, somebody hangs it on the wall in their home, and there's a kind of communication that happens there. I've talked to many artists who feel like their art isn't really complete until it lands somewhere and somebody is living with it and appreciating it. It sounds to me like what you're describing is very similar to that, but it's much more immediate. So it's a way for you all to communicate the whole journey of being a furry to each other in ways that are accessible and shareable with each other, which is amazing. And that brings me to the question of your artwork and you then, or Atmos, then becoming the subject of Tommy's photography. Is that how it works?
I think that's a way to put it. Yeah, and so there are some kind of steps to get there. So I mean, coming back to like, you know, where I began with art, you know, was with photography and digital photography, feeling immediate, and also me not really feeling like not having a lot of kind of like a self-reflection until high school, which I think is normal for a lot of people. But I feel like I used the camera, and I used particularly self-portraiture as a teenager as a way to kind of discover and create myself. So that wasn't making furry self-portraits. That was just making, weird self-portraits while I listened to my hipster music, in the basement, and thought like maybe I could be an artist. And so I had this practice of self-portraiture. And at the same time, I was finding the furry community as a queer teenager on the internet, looking for community and looking for a place to kind of like invent myself. So I found the furry community, kept it a secret because it's got all of this kind of like baggage around, being childish and also being kind of perverse for its like kind of like overlap with queerness and cartoons. There's a whole lot of baggage that we can get into. Well, we actually don't have to. But so I had these kind of two threads of myself, and I got to art school, and I decided to start taking pictures of other furries as my kind of excuse to go to these events. Because in art school, everyone's trying to be really cool, and furries at the time in the early 10s were still seen as pretty strange and nerdy, and like I think art school has somewhat taken a turn on it that now it's kind of cool to be a furry. But anyway, so I kept these kind of two separate paths where I continued engaging in self-portraiture, and I was also beginning this documentary work about the furry community. And this was kind of a very conceited effort on my part to make images of this culture that I thought, kind of lionized it, made it look as cool and as interesting and like beautiful as I thought it was. So I was going to, small meetups. I was visiting people in their homes. I started traveling to conventions. And I made a blog where I was posting, these documentary pictures at parties and at conventions. And that's kind of how I really got my foot in the culture, was having this project as my excuse to really engage in it and fall into it. And I kept that up for about 5 years until, I was pretty well ingrained into it. I was starting to really openly identify as a furry. I early on, I was worried that if I let it be known that I was a furry, that my work would be seen as, not objective and then therefore not credible. And I kind of turned the corner to think like, well, actually,
maybe the opposite.
It's great to have someone representing themselves, their own culture. And I think that's who we want representing. And in 2015, I spoke to some friends who were making costumes, professionally for the furry community. And they invited me to come out and live with them for about a month while they made my fursuit. I don't know if I've covered that term. Fursuit is the name for the costumes. So they made Atmos. And from that point on, I started to get to just be Atmos at conventions and be him for my own enjoyment. But I also now had a way to combine my interest in self-portraiture with my interest in making work about this community. So that's where, the two kind of collided, and that's where I think my work has continued to spring from since then. Almost 10 years now. That's crazy.
Wow. And you spoke a minute ago about wanting to step up the appreciation for the furry community and make it as beautiful for other people as it was for you. Mm-hmm. And I have to say you did that, Tommy, because your photographs are absolutely stunning. And the imagery is so unusual and arresting in a positive way. And it's actually found its way into some important collections. So you've really gotten your job done there. How does it feel to have the furry community now received and, a part of mainstream culture?
Layered question there. Mainstream culture, we can talk on that afterwards. But, the feeling of, if I could go back in time and show myself what I'm doing, I could cry just thinking about that. And I do in some ways have that kind of experience I was at a furry convention in January, and I was speaking on a small panel with a few other kind of academics who make work reflecting on the furry community. And we had somebody come up afterwards and say, like, this is my first convention, and I, never thought I would hear somebody talk about furry in this kind of like serious and reflective manner. That's what I wish I could have heard when I was like 18 and insecure. And so it's a great feeling. I think there's still so much more to do. There's still so much more I want to do. But yeah, I think furry is often looked at as kind of like haha funny and not much more. And I think humor is an extremely useful tool socially, but also within art. I think novelty is a great way to kind of bring someone in. I think that's one of the things that's really effective about my portraiture of furries is that like these are kind of like new bodies, new figures that we don't really have a lot of kind of like verbiage for this kind of idea. Like we have cartoons, and then this is like a cartoon put into the real world. So there's this mixed kind of visual language that's going on that I think is really, really, to me, really exciting to make pictures of. But then I also think, so there's this kind of like novel engagement on the front end, but I also think to me, I'm interested in using furry, like the furry aesthetic, the concept of this identity is for relating it to, the other things that are happening in my life and in this world. So like, it's easy to kind of look at furry as like just a kind of random fluke of the internet, evidence that anything can happen online. But to me, there is a strong relationship to, like I said, the way that, we have begun kind of using the internet to create and to relate to the world, and the way we recreate ourselves online. I also think it speaks to, for my generation and for Gen X, and generations after me, our relationship to media, that like I said, my childhood was mostly spent playing video games. Like I identified with characters before I identified consciously with myself, really. Wow. And cartoons, I think, are the same way for certain kinds of people, that we, because we live such a media saturated life, and now that's through the personal device, through the phone, through YouTube, through everything. I think that, it kind of makes a certain sense that if you're consuming all this media, you might make a kind of media, a cartoon, a fictionalized version of yourself. So I think that is a really kind of like important thing to consider, that furry is doing. There's all this, why is it coming from animals? I think there's an interesting, or why is furry, centered around animals? I think there's, for one, cartoons primarily being a lot of animals, but I think there's also, this is like it's not necessarily an evidence-based concept, but I think furry is in some ways kind of, it's our way to cross over the uncanny valley, to get far away enough from reality, because I think reality is pretty bleak and painful. I think we also feel kind of lonely because we have really eliminated our actual interactions with other animals. Other than like pets, we don't really have, the majority of people don't have any kind of deep social or pragmatic, practical relationship to animals. That is just the way that we've kind of made the world now. So I think furry is kind of even more appealing because we kind of, I think, maybe long for that reintegration into the animal kingdom.
Yeah, it was definitely deep in our psyche. When you first told me about Atmos, your character, and how you created or how you derived that, I don't know what the right word would be, but given that I grew up and spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania myself, so the white-tailed deer is an animal that I can relate to, and even though I grew up on the east side of the state, certainly deer hunting is something that I'm very familiar with, and I was very intrigued by your story, which I would like you to tell, of how you came upon Atmos and the whole predator prey, and how that just gives you an opportunity to kind of rewrite your own history from being somebody who was a victim to somebody who is able to own and embrace and celebrate an aspect of yourself that maybe wasn't so safe when you were a child.
Yeah. So Atmos is an interesting character for me. As you said, I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm from Central PA. I grew up in a college town, so I wasn't in like uber rural PA. But on like the first day of hunting season, you would lose about 20% of the school. Like the students would just take that day off. So deer hunting was on the list to me, kind of right up there with like football and sports broadly, as this kind of like prime representative of masculinity in Pennsylvania. And I was an extremely, I wasn't like outwardly effeminate, but I was kind of like extremely afraid of like contests of masculinity. I hated sports. My parents, tried to throw every sport at me because they were trying to be helpful, but it was so humiliating to me to like engage in these like kind of contests of masculinity. Didn't want to get my driver's license, all of this stuff that to me always felt like these kind of like failures to be a man, or to be a boy even, and also to be clear, not in any way that I was like I want to be a girl. I didn't have this kind of like experience of like trans disidentification with masculinity. I just was like, I want to be a boy like how I am. I think that this should be fine. And part of that was growing up and having desire for queerness as well. And so when I was finding the furry community, and when I was coming up with a character to kind of call myself, I think part of this attraction to the idea of being a white-tailed deer was this desire to kind of subvert the narrative of masculinity in deer hunting. To say like, oh, like the deer is the prize of this relationship, this longed for subject. I think it's kind of like a funny, FU to say like, oh, well, so you want me now, like why, how about the boys chase after me? And even I think there's something kind of macabre about the like, taking ownership of the narrative of like gay, gay bashing and queer bullying, to kind of like, there's this kind of leads into some work. So maybe it might be effective to kind of talk about that. I recently made a screen print, and I based this screen print off of shooting range target practice posters.
Oh, wow.
So I can pull up an image of it in a second here. So I made this picture of Atmos kind of posing, kind of like a pinup almost. Mm-hmm. And then his body is broken up into different point targets. And so the idea is that you would actually take this poster and shoot it and get a score. And the scoring is, here, I'll share my screen and we can just start looking at it if that's all right. Can you see that okay?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the piece, the title comes from an interaction I actually had while I was at a Cabela's. I was buying a trail cam for another project, which we'll talk about, but it was on Halloween and I had my fursuit in my car and I was like, well, let's just go in here in my costume and
no
shop.
way. You went into Cabela's as Atmos?
I did. Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
God, I wish I could have seen that.
It was,
wow.
It was interesting. It was honest. It was super fascinating. Almost immediately, as soon as I came in, one of the attendants came up and he was like kind of very excited to help me. And as he was walking me to the cameras, he's like, I know what you're wearing and I think it's cool. And it turned out this guy was like a closeted, like he wasn't quite a furry, but he was like furry curious. And he like took a picture with me. And so I felt pretty safe once he was around me because I knew like, wasn't going to get too harassed. But I did, as I was leaving, another person, just shopping there. So this was October, and this person said like, well, be careful, it's hunting season out there. And I turned around and just said, don't threaten me with a good time. And he gave me kind of the weirdest laugh. and it was like, yes, this is the kind of energy I want to put out, is like flipping the script on this kind of like violent domination and turning it into kind of like a queer BDSM reading. Like instead saying like, oh no, I'm into it, like dom me, and I think, when we kind of like, I think art is a world of fantasy, in a lot of ways. And, by talking about these ideas, talking about this like fear of death, fear of punishment, of ridicule, of anything, by turning it into kind of role play, I think it subverts some of the power there. So that "Don't Threaten Me with a Good Time" became the title, and it's across the top of this poster, along with this target of Atmos, and just to read off the scoring chart here, for ranking from low to high points, it goes rank 0 to 25 points, make me laugh, up to make me cry, to make me scream, and make me yours is like out of the park. And so it kind of rides the line of like pain and pleasure, scream and cry, being these kind of, and make me yours is like, the ultimate, like, you've killed me, I'm your, you have dominated me, I am yours.
Wow. It's so powerful. And I'd like to put this slide up in the episode notes, because I think it would be really cool for listeners to have access to that. Of course, I'll have your website up there too, and
Sure.
Whatever you have up there. But I think this is so interesting, because for me, that one of the reasons I'm doing this whole podcast is that, I want people to get inside the minds of the most creative among us. And, most people associate art with, a painting or a sculpture. But really, for me, what I'm curious about is like, how do we redefine the way we see the world completely, like completely taking that paradigm and turning it on its head? And then what becomes available for us, not just to be contrary, because what you're doing is with the use of humor and irony and all these things, you're really creating a way to turn the narrative into something altogether different, which is the ultimate in creativity. So I really applaud you for this.
Thank you.
You're also doing a podcast series based on this.
Yeah. So that is that's a new project that I've been working on, that should be premiering soon. So that is a show called Please Stop Talking About Furries. And that title kind of comes from this like chip on my shoulder that I think I've always had about furries, and this kind of like, constantly trying to fight for like the legitimacy and the relevance of this culture in the broader picture. So the show it's a mix of things. It's one-on-one interviews with other artists and creators and members in this community, and talking to them about their work, about their kind of like their beginnings and their engagement in this community. Because I think everyone has a really different and interesting kind of origin story with furry. But then there are also going to be episodes that are kind of like a topic reflection. So I have plans to talk about, like specific Disney films, like The Lion King, as a kind of like, a just meteor into this culture that, for so many people, that was, that is kind of the ideal that they come back to, is like the kind of look and design of those characters, the feel of that world, or something like Zootopia. Well, that's two Disney films. There's other stuff besides Disney. But also too, I think like an episode that I'm really excited to do is an episode on Tony the Tiger. And actually, the first episode that is going to be on the podcast starts to talk about this story. It's an interview with another furry kind of fine artist named Mark Zubrovich, who he and I had a 2-person show just last summer, in summer 2023, of our work. And my work was these paintings of Tony the Tiger that I've been working on. And this is in relationship to a kind of a Twitter snafu where Kellogg's created a Twitter account called Real Tony Tiger. And then they used that account to kind of like simulate like Tony's real and have him like tweet about his life. So it'd be Tony the Tiger saying like, oh, can't wait for the big game, you know, and like tweeting a selfie, you know, or like it's like there's a lot of feet pictures weirdly. Like it's like Tony's feet at the beach and on the soccer field and all these like Tony foot pictures. But anyway, so this account got made and furries, you know, I remember it kept popping up in my like advertisements, like it was like we were being targeted by it. And so furries started saying like, Tony's real? Well, I think Tony's really hot. And so like in all of his posts, there were all these like thirst responses, you know, of people saying like, you know, pick me up, Tony, or like, you know, frost my flakes, daddy, you know, at their more vulgar. And this kept going until the account literally snapped. So the person who was running it for Kellogg's tweeted out saying like, that's it, I quit. I don't get paid enough for this shit. Like, I'm sick of these furries. And they like went on a blocking spree. I'm blocked by the account, you know, like all these other friends got blocked by it. And then the account deleted itself. And so I feel bad for the person who ran the account, but who I don't feel bad for is primarily Tony the Tiger, because he's not real. and I think this is kind of, I'm interested in the fact that this happened as a kind of logical conclusion to this kind of like intensifying like relationship that brands, that marketing, you know, are kind of asking for from people, right? That, you know, like Disney loves a Marvel stan, you know, like they love for these people to like take a bullet for these imaginary characters because they know that means, you know, we have a dedicated consumer who's going to buy everything, who, you know, will dedicate a large part of their money and their life and, you know, what they talk about to our IP. And that means money for us. And Tony the Tiger is, you know, an example of that from my childhood, that I watched these commercials, you know, that said like you should love Tony and therefore love Frosted Flakes. This cereal will make you good at hockey. Like, it's like insane claims, like all for the sake of selling me sugary cereal, telling me that it's good for me. And Tony is this like character that is, they designed him to be loved. And so I think it's really interesting to say, okay, I really love him, and kind of come up against a kind of a barrier in our, what is acceptable in our culture. You know, that it is not acceptable to want to, can I say the F word?
Well, look, it's understood.
Yeah. I want to do that with Tony. And that is, you know, that it suddenly makes this brand uncomfortable. So these paintings were kind of a lot of paintings of Tony the Tiger and Atmos kind of in love. There's a lot of glory holes as this kind of like double up of like, it's also like a food hole for cereal. You know, or I made a set of cornhole boards, you know, with one on Tony's mouth and then one on Atmos's butt. And so you can play cornhole, which is a sport, but it's also this sexualized thing in corn and cornflakes, you know. Just like, it was a really fun project to kind of like play with this idea, you know, and kind of like using this community's like stigma of kind of perverse and strange sexuality, and using it as like kind of a political tool to prove a point, to agitate, you know, something, to say like, I'm not the crazy one here. You know, I'm kind of doing what you asked. And if you don't like it, then I think, you know, maybe that's cause for us to reassess how we are manipulating children and manipulating people with advertising.
Well, it's such a great Aikido move. You know, you're taking their energy and kind of like whipping the momentum of it.
Exactly.
You know? And again, it's a really interesting and creative way to approach activism. You know, to incorporate that humor and to do that Aikido move and to take the energy of what they're trying to, you know, they want you to fall in love, but they also just want you to fall in love up to this point and then do what you're supposed to do, buy the product, ingest the product, buy more product, etc. Exactly. So, you know, you're just calling that into relief, you know, and you're shedding some light on that. So yeah. I think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's definitely how I like to think of art as being useful. Like I try to have somewhat of like a realistic, like, you know, view of what art's impact can be. That it's, you know, this isn't a thing that, you know, makes something happen, but it is a thing that can disrupt. It can disrupt a narrative. It can, you know, make somebody see something from a new perspective. It can kind of ask questions and complicate things. And that's kind of what I'm interested in doing with this stuff, is not providing a solution so much as just reflecting on it.
I suppose, you know, people talk about the evil of technology and the internet and all these the confusion that's being created by having all these avatars that are not really real, and what is really real anyway. So kind of begs a whole nother universe of questions of who are we and how do we present ourselves to the world and that whole journey.
Right. And I do think, you know, I think there are reasons that we consider it a problem. You know, I think problem, you know, like the problem of furry, you know, or of, you know, like, because I think, well, because the furry community is very closely aligned, there are a lot of trans and queer people within the furry community, for a lot of reasons, you know, quite obviously being like that furry is a place to experiment with yourself and to do so in a safe space. And I think that becomes a very friendly space for someone to say like, hey, I think I feel like this. And people can say, okay, you know, people are ready to say, okay, and yes. But I think furry is also, it's not necessarily about like replacing yourself so much as it is about like with a new definition, but it's about adding another. You know, I don't necessarily think of, you know, Atmos as the real me. I think of him as another me. And, you know, the reason that that's a problem, you know, for some is because it's confusing and it makes you slow down. And when we get confused and when we slow down, we're less efficient. And efficiency is so ingrained in us now, you know, that everything needs to be right and, you know, like go well and smoothly. And all of this, I think, is kind of us having a capitalist, hyper-capitalist mindset ingrained in us. And so I think that to me is part of my my interest as well, is this, you know, way of complicating ourselves in a way that we don't fit perfectly into a system that I think is being pretty hard on us.
Yeah. So what have you learned from Atmos? How has Tommy changed from getting to know Atmos and having a creative outlet for Atmos?
Wow. That's like a therapy question.
Well, one of the reasons I'm curious about it is because I think of people like myself and a lot of people on the journey of life, you know, they get to a point where they feel like they've got this creative or some part of themselves that has just not yet been explored. And it can feel like a scary place. They feel like if they tap into that, it's a Pandora's box of all kinds of who knows what. It's unknown, uncharted territory. I think that it can seem very scary. So I guess one of the reasons I'm asking the question is I'm wondering if by getting to know Atmos, has it given you more space to be Tommy more completely in the world as an artist, or however you might want to speak about that?
Yeah. For me, my relationship to Atmos is that he is kind of like me with the vibrancy turned all the way up. He is kind of like a superstar, you know, cartoon version of myself. I think what what I enjoy about the kind of the nature of the deer, I think that's a good way to kind of like talk about this, is that they're a multivalent kind of figure, that we can see the deer as, on one hand, I think a kind of a specific symbol of masculinity. I think one that is not necessarily based around violence, based around something else, about this like kind of like serene, majestic image of a deer.
And the grace, grace and the poise and all these other beautiful things. Yeah.
This kind of image of, like the steward of the forest, I think is like a really like exciting thing to embody. But then the other aspect of the deer is, this idea that they are like giant rats, like they are this big invasive species, and they're kind of dummies, this clumsy kind of goofy creature, that's like stumbling through a parking lot or something like that. And so I think I really enjoy, getting to play kind of a goofy figure as Atmos, but also, when I want to, this kind of like serious, kind of like gentle figure. And I think there is some sort of strength in deer as well, thinking about like the idea of these antlers, the idea of kind of like a rut or defending or something like that. But yeah, I think, Atmos helps me understand, again, my kind of like core relationship to humor as a foil, humor and beauty as a foil to get kind of people to humor, beauty, a kind of cuteness, a softness, as a way to be understood and to be related to. I had this performance piece where I entered into a gallery space as Atmos, kind of cold, like there was no introduction for it. I walked into the space, picked up a microphone, and I gave this monologue where I talk about waking up every day and wondering, is today the day that a man with a gun is going to come to where I am and shoot me? And as the monologue progresses, it kind of flips back and forth between, a deer saying this and, me as a human saying this. And that, I think, was a really kind of like powerful space for me to engage in, and continues to be, to think of the deer as, on one hand, I think kind of a symbol of a white male in America. I think about Bambi as basically being, the young white prince of America, told that this world is his. It's complicated, but I think there's this, I identify with it as this, white central Pennsylvanian from the suburbs. But then I also just think of it as, kind of a helpless figure, a helpless American figure, running in droves from an aggressor. And, that has continued to be an image, an idea that I reflect on with my work, is this kind of specter of shooting in America, and how to engage in it.
Wow. Well, given the climate that we're living in, with shootings being, daily occurrence practically, that's another really real thing. Wow. So say a little bit more. We've got a few more minutes left, but just say a little bit more about what else you've got coming up, what's on the horizon for you.
Yeah. So I run a Patreon, and that is my primary kind of like funding source for my work, along with sales. But I'm preparing to kind of redouble my effort on that. I post works in progress. I'll be posting the podcast episodes early. And so I'm working on that. That's patreon.com/Tommy Bruce. I'm currently working on, I mean, like I said, I've got about 100 irons in the fire. But a big project that is kind of forthcoming, I'm seeking grant funding for right now, is a series that I'm calling Wild Night. That is a series of images shot on infrared, like kind of trail cam look. So that is a series of furries in the woods in kind of like late night urban environments. It's a cross between trail cams and this project Kohei Yoshiyuki's The Park. He was this Japanese photographer who photographed cruising parks in Japan in the 70s and 80s. So I'm taking furries out into these environments and staging these kind of like, what do the animals do? They hunt, they fight, they screw, they do whatever it is that animals do kind of in this unselfconscious manner. And so I'm restaging those kinds of scenes. And this infrared look gives them these kind of like bizarre color shifts. All the furs are like made of acrylic, so they react strangely to the light. So that's a project that I'm working on towards an exhibition and a book. I've got. I've been doing a lot of collages. That's another big project right now. Taking my images, collaging them together with text and things like that. Be happy to share one or two of those as well.
Well, I guess I don't need to ask you a question that I have for some of my mid-career artists, which is, what happens when you get to a slump or a stopping point, or when you don't know what to do next? Sounds like that has never, ever been a problem for you.
No, I always find myself with too many ideas and not enough time. What I think my advice is, to myself and to others, if you're in this position and you're kind of afraid of having too many ideas, is just to make sure that you write them down somewhere and be okay with picking things up and putting them down. Because I find that is, actually a necessary kind of part of my practice is this, I think for a long time, I execute something, and then, I hit another wall, take that energy, go somewhere else, let this other thing kind of just like marinate and then come back to it. I think, other advice. I don't know. The one that's always helpful to me is separating the making from the critiquing process.
We could spend a lot of time on that.
So easy to just be making something and say like, well, it's not good, and then you stop. As opposed to like, is this good? Is this bad? That doesn't matter right now. Let's get it out. and that you learn, as soon as you've made it, you learn something from it, and then you go from there.
So does Atmos weigh in on some of that creative decision, or is Atmos more of a muse, or is Atmos, creative director, or?
I think Atmos is a muse is probably the best way to say it, particularly in the fact that when I do put him on for pictures, or like look at a picture of him, surprises happen all the time, because I can't fully articulate myself and my body when I'm wearing him. Usually the way I'm taking pictures is I'm setting my camera up, setting the whole scene, kind of like figuring out like, okay, here's my framing. And then I set the camera to just take pictures for, 5 or 10 minutes. And I just go and I just be, and that's how a lot of these images get made, is that then I'm pulling from that and kind of seeing like what happens and what comes up.
Wow. Well, it feels like for some reason, like that's a good place to end it, Atmos as muse. And I love that idea. And I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to me today.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us today. Please like and follow us on artstorming.org, where you'll find a list of our shows, a transcript of this episode with links to the guest page, as well as our other projects. ArtStorming is brought to you and supported by ArtBridge and listeners like you. Look for us on your favorite podcast platforms.